All right, welcome everybody. All right, here we go. I got Nikita. Nikita's so awesome. She comes and runs back, takes care of everything. I want to thank John today for helping me out. Thank you, John. You're a good man. Your check's in the mail. All right, well, let's go ahead and have a prayer, and then let's get going. Father, thank you so much for allowing us to do this. Father, I am just so grateful that you've put this on my heart to teach. And Father, that you put on the people's heart to learn about your Old Testament and your Bible. Father, there's nothing better than to understand what we're reading. And we just commit it to you, and please have it open our hearts so we be able to receive it today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so today we are actually going through the lands of the Bible. So, if you ever going through a book, let's just say you're in Ezekiel, let's say, and you're looking at Ezekiel and you're going, okay, you stumble across these guys' name or those guys' name. Who the heck are they? We are going to talk about that today. We're not going to go over everybody in the Bible. We're going to touch on 10 different countries, or I should say peoples. Okay? And the other thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about a little bit of history today too. But first, I've got something to show you. This is so cool. They did this. The ancestors of Nebuchadnezzar II have been found. Is that amazing or what? They found the ancestors. There's a picture, nice beard he got there. Here's another picture of Nebuchadnezzar II. They found his ancestors in America, of all places. In America. This is the god Marduk. Now, isn't it interesting? God Marduk looks just like Nebuchadnezzar. Wonder what that's about. Well, it looks like maybe they're trying to make them in his own image. But you know what, Marduk? We found the ancestors, and here they are. Is that amazing or what? We found them. We got them. They're right there. And here's another picture of them. I mean, other than the fedora and the glasses. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I can see the resemblance. I don't know about you guys, but anyway. No, I'm just kidding. And one of those guys just died, by the way. It's really sad. All right. So we're going to start with some history stuff also today. In history, there's some very important things to understand. For instance, when looking back, we must understand a few things. First, the lives of the people we study are completely different. Lived in a completely different time than we do. And I know you're like, oh, duh, of course they did. Well, but we're going to go into a bunch of different stuff, and we're going to talk about things, and we're going to try to understand things through history. And that's the hardest thing about going through history, is trying to wrap our mind around what was going on in that period. We cannot assume that they think the same thing we do, because they didn't. All right, a little bit of history. This is from the Didache. The Didache is the earliest, I love this document, but it's the earliest known Christian document. And this is something written to teach people. This was like from a new believers class. Now this is interesting on baptism, how they see baptism. Having instructed them in all these teachings, baptize the catechumen, we'll talk about that in a minute, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, in running water. Well, actually, one of the historians I like to read, Dr. Ryan Reeves, he says that's actually translated living water, meaning that they actually said you should do it in a river. Okay? They did it in a river. Now, I know that most, today we always want to make sure we're going to try to be as much as like Jesus as possible, much like the Old Testament as possible. But they had to do it in a river. Okay? But if you cannot do it in running water, then baptize in other water, which would be a lake. If you cannot in cold water, wait a minute, whoa, wait, cold water? But wait a minute, if they were trying to be as much like Jesus as possible, they're right, if you think about it, because cold water is mountain runoff water. And what do you think the Jordan was? Where I come from in Colorado, mountain runoff water, whenever the snow's building up, when it melts, that water is about 40 degrees. And so that's what they were saying. Well, we should try to do it in living water and cold water. If you come out in cold water. Okay, if you neither have living water or cold water, pour water on the head 3 times. Now, today a lot of Protestants are like, oh, wait a minute, that's bad. You can't do that. Well, you know, in my opinion, this is one of the greatest documents because what it does is it touches people that anywhere they lived. If you're living in the middle of the desert and there is no rivers for 300 miles. Now, I went to college in New Mexico. There are no rivers for like 300 miles. No water for living. What is the most precious commodity that you have? Water. And so the reason why they did that was to make sure that when they teach people, wherever they lived, they were able to say, at least you can do it this way. Because if you're living in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert, see the land of the Bible, that's what it was like, then you don't have the ability to fill up a baptismal with lots of water. You want to conserve what you have. So it's amazing in history how they touch this. They touch these subjects. But they said, of course, the best way would be in a river, cold river. Interesting. So now, also, look what they also said. Make sure to let the baptizer and the catechumen fast. Let's talk about the catechumen. Now, a catechumen is just a word that we use, meaning one who is going to be instructed to be baptized. It is it's of Greek and Latin origin. Nothing to worry about, but we would actually call that person, say that catechumen would be in a D group. Or we'd say that they were in a new believers class. Okay, if you're not from this church, if you're on YouTube and you're listening to this, you can say new believers class, you can say D group, whatever, that's what they were. They just used that back in the day. So isn't it interesting how history, we have to kind of wrap our heads around what they're talking about. Now, interesting thing, last week Jeff talked about abortion. I love what the Didache says about abortion. You shall not murder a child by abortion. Wow. They really came out and said it. Nor kill a child at birth. It's pretty amazing. So our ancestors, this is what our original Christian ancestors were taught. So they were very, very specific on this. And I love this. And if you want, I can give you information on how to read this. I think you'll be fascinated by it. And let me tell you, I like to read it because sometimes it is so strong, you're just like, oh my gosh. Now, I'm not saying don't read the Bible, read this instead. You just got to remember that this information here were given to people, and this is where new believers were taught for about 300 years, from about the time at the end of where John died in about 90 AD till about around 300 to 350 AD. All right, history in the Bible. The second thing we must do dealing with history is take the good and the bad. Historically, there is good stuff that happens, there is bad stuff that happens. We saw that over the last couple weeks with polytheism. Much of the Old Testament speaks of the lives of the people who succeeded and failed at their relationship with God. But this should give us comfort because knowing that they deal with the exact same things as we do. So one of the things I love about the Bible is I can relate to it. These guys go through the same things I go through. We can learn from them. And that's what we're doing, is really learning from them. So history is really the good, the bad, and the ugly. You always hear this, whatever you hear that, I can hear. You guys are like, yeah, that's exactly what I hear when I read that. So you always had this in the back of your head. But the thing is, the goal is that we can learn from their good stuff, their bad stuff, and their ugly stuff. All right. So we're going to be talking about the lands of the Bible, so let's talk about how many times things are mentioned in the Bible. When we're dealing with these guys, how many times? Because you know what? They say that, if something is stated 2 or 3 times, it must be important, right? Well, think about it. If it's saying 20 times, that means it's very important. If it's stated 100 times, it's extremely important. And if it's stated 624 times, that must be very, very, very extremely important. So Egypt in the Bible is mentioned more than anything else, and it's mentioned 624 times. Is that amazing or what? Assyria, 125 times in 14 different books. Now, some of you may be thinking to yourself, I don't even know what Assyria is. But they mention it 14 different books in the Bible. Babylon, 291, and including 4 books in the New Testament talk about Babylon. If you're like, who's Babylon? Maybe something you need to learn, because that is important information. Edom, we're going to be talking about them 119 times. Moab, 139. Now, this isn't found in Utah. Yes, it is found in Utah, but that's not these guys. They're not Mormons. Ammon, 19 times. The Philistines, 221 times. Tyre, 64 times, and Persia, 64 times in 9 books. So, now, Persia, that 64 times in 9 books, it's actually in a lot more than that. Not directly referenced as Persia, but referenced as something else. So, Persia's actually most likely more than probably 150 times in everything. So let me tell you, these are important to know. So what we're going to do is, we're not going to go into the history of these people today. We're just going to go into a little bit of information that you know where they are. We're going to go into maps. We're going to go into some timeline, a little bit of timelines. We will spend time in history in a few weeks when we get to the law. Okay, when we get to the law will be coming in 2 weeks, and that's going to be a huge one. We have a lot of stuff to do with that. But we're just basically going to talk about a few things. All right, let's talk about languages. The Semitic language. Now, most of the languages spoken back then were Semitic. Now, we always hear the word anti-Semite. Well, Semite and Semitic really comes from Shem. Ham, Shem, Japheth, 3 sons of Noah. This Shem, and don't ask me why, I think I have a feeling it's Greek, but part of it actually is there's a Hebrew origin and a Greek origin with both his names. But the thing is, this particular language, the Semitic language, was spoken by a ton of people. Arabics, Ethiopians, Sudan, Hebrew, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Iran, Iraq, Maltese. Okay, there's a bunch of languages, the Semitic language. So when they say Semite, that's not a really good characterization to say anti-Semite is Israel, because Arabs are also considered Semitic languages, Arabic. So really, pretty much everybody in the Middle East, you can say, have origins with Semitic languages. Cuneiform writing. This is the writing that they did back then. This comes from the Neo-Assyrian. Now, there was pretty much most everybody wrote in this style. This is how they would write. And the good news is that the Bible's not the only way we can get historical information. There is historical information from a ton of people. Everybody that we're going to talk about has historical information about it. Now, we're going to mention the Persians in the end, but the Persians, you always hear the Medes and the Persians. I didn't add the Medes in there because the Medes were one of the few groups that did not have writing, for the most part. They had some, but nothing of anything substantial. So we're not going to go into those guys. But this is cuneiform writing. This is Hebrew. Now, sorry my slide looks weird, but I tried to make them big. The one on this side, that is Hebrew today. The one on this side over here, that is Hebrew, ancient Hebrew from around the time when they were using cuneiform. So really, they were very similar language, but they had their own, and it wasn't cuneiform. It was very similar. But again, if we go back, really, cuneiform means the wedge. It's like wedge, so kind of like wedges, like squares and everything else. No circles, nothing like that. So, by the way, here's a quiz for you. Which language written today has circles in most of their characters? Anybody know? Which written language has circles? Pardon me? Spanish? No, not really circles per se. I'm talking like ovals and circles within their characters. Chinese? Actually, no. You're close. It's Korean. Korean. If you ever see, it's so easy to tell Korean because you're going to see a character with an oval in the middle of it. There's ovals everywhere in Korean writing. When I lived in Japan for a couple years, and I studied Korean, Japanese, Chinese, a little bit of that. And kanji, which is Chinese, they really don't use much circles at all, but it's mainly in Korean. So good job. All right. So what I want to go first, we have to understand what's going on today. This is a map of today. This comes from Google Maps, as you can see. And what I want you guys to see is this whole area right here is the complete area we're going to be talking about. If you go to if you go to, on this side, there's Iran. Okay, that's going to be where Persia comes from. Then we have the Persian Gulf coming down here. Now, one of the things I want you to see where it says Kuwait? Now, I want you to draw a line, horizontal line, straight across from Kuwait. From there down, Riyadh, Medina, Bahrain, all that stuff. We're almost completely not going to talk about anything below that line of Kuwait on this side, where Saudi Arabia is, because it's so much desert out there, very few people even went down there. We're going to see that majority of our people either come from the Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. They never went down there. You're going to see that their stuff went literally right around it because there's nothing there. It's the middle of nowhere down there. So that's where we're going to talk. But all the way up north, usually up where Turkey is pretty much where we're going to stop. But Turkey's there. Egypt is on the other side over here. So I want you to keep this in mind when we look through all this stuff so that you can remember what we're talking about, where they are at this time. All right, we're going to go over Egypt first because I think that's what most people are most interested in. So we're going to kind of do a little bit more information on Egypt. Egypt, I like to say them as the conqueror, the instigator, and the savior. Egypt has been around longer than anybody else, and they've stayed around. They played a major role in the Old and the New Testament. We know that that's where Jesus went. We know that that's where Abraham went. That's where Moses went. That's where Joshua's there. We know that David went to Egypt. We know that a lot of people went down to Egypt because Egypt was a big influencing power. So we have to understand about Egypt, and they're talked about more than anybody else. And they're the only country that I know of, and I don't think there's, if you let me know if I'm wrong here, but I don't think there is any other country that has lasted from the time of, the Bible until now with the same name. Israel went away in 130 AD and didn't come back until 1947. The Palestinians came back in 1920. So Egypt's the only one that actually stayed around all this time. So here's a thing of Egypt today, what Egypt looks like today with Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Now, it's important to talk about Ethiopia because Ethiopia is very, very important in our history. Because does anybody know what comes from Ethiopia that has a relationship with Egypt? What comes from Ethiopia that has a relationship with Egypt? The Nile River. The Nile. And the Nile is everything. Okay? It actually starts in modern-day Ethiopia. Okay? It actually starts in modern-day Ethiopia. And so the Nile, can you see the blue Nile, white Nile, the Nile? It's everything in Egypt. Without the Nile, no one would even they would have just been a bunch of nomads down there. So here's a picture of the Nile, and this is kind of what we call that the Fertile Crescent. What we kind of call this the fertile area. Now this area, you can see where it's green, that's where the most crops are grown, which kind of goes up into the Levant up there, Canaan up there, and then we go all the way down where there's Cush. Okay, but this is kind of traces where the green parts and where Egypt actually went. All right, here's another shot of the Nile and how the different places in the Nile. As you can see, where it's all green, that's where people lived. So the Nile was a very, very influencing part of Egypt. Upper Nile versus Lower Nile. Now this gets kind of confusing because you would think Upper Nile is up near the Mediterranean Sea up there. That's not it. Upper Nile, or Upper Egypt, is actually down below, down south. Lower Egypt is north. So the reason why that is that way, and they call it that way, because before about 3000 BC, they were two different countries. They merged, and that's where the Egyptian kingdom came from. So the Upper Nile was basically down, that was one country, the Lower Nile was the other country. Now, when you see like Alexandria, Heliopolis, all those guys weren't there. Those guys came after the Bible, during Alexander the Great and his tenure there. Sorry. All right, the Nile River is the lifeblood of Egypt. It drains from the mountains of Ethiopia. The mountains of Ethiopia, and for you guys out there, is 14,928. Give you a little hint what that's like in America. It's actually higher than all the other peaks in the continental United States. Anybody know what the highest mountain in the United States is? Anybody? I'm sorry? McKinley, right. Do you know how big it is? It's over 20. Over 20, yeah, that's in Alaska. But in the continental, good job. In the continental United States, it actually is in California. I don't exactly remember which, but it's around, I think it's 14,600. But the thing is, so the Nile actually had a bunch of what we call, in Colorado, we used to call the 14ers. They had a lot of 14ers there, and what happened, of course, we know that a lot of snowfall, a lot of drainage, and that's where the Nile comes. And the nice thing about it is, it's about 4,123 miles in length, is because it comes from direct runoff from these guys, and it had very, very consistent seasons. Oops, that's not what I want to do. So it was very predictable, which means when it flooded, they knew it was going to flood. They knew it was, so why do you think, and you read in the Bible that Jacob and his sons went down there? Why do you think Abraham went down there? Because they were probably going through a drought, and Egypt had food because they had the Nile. And regardless, even if there's a drought, rivers just don't stop for the most part. They just don't go away. So the thing is, the Nile was very, very important. Regularly harvested crops. So when we get to Mesopotamia, meaning between the two rivers, that's going to be a big difference because they flooded irregularly and wiped out crops quite often. But the Nile, that's the reason why it was such a big influence and why Egypt continued even to today, is because of that. So why choose Egypt? Well, the population in the 15th century, about 1500 BC, was around the Exodus, was around 2 to 4 million people. That's a lot back then. Because you got to remember, most people didn't live past the age of 40 during those times. They didn't live that old because of disease. It was one of the most populated places known in the world. That's why everybody wanted to go down there. Even though much of it was Nile, the Nile allowed many to survive during droughts. Alexandria is about 600 miles from Jerusalem. Remember, guys, I promised you some miles here, so you got to get 600 miles there. It took me about this long. All right, so I even put on here, it's about the same distance between here and Charlotte, North Carolina. So Cairo is about 250 miles from Jerusalem. So this is what Egypt looks like without the Nile. These are two pictures of the Western Desert. Let me tell you, it's ugly. But let me tell you, but the thing is, without the Nile, that's what Egypt looked like outside the Nile. This is the Nile River Valley. I think this can show you guys why Egypt was so important in the Bible and why so many people went down to it, because they had crops. Even when it was drought and everybody else was starving, they had nice crops. Joseph's waterway, guess what? Joseph is real. Joseph lived in Egypt. Joseph built a waterway. A lot of the people today deny the Exodus. But the thing is, Joseph was there. So the canal built by Joseph produced some of the most luscious orchards in Africa to today. So Joseph was there, okay? Joseph was there around 1900 BC. So there are more than 30 dynasties. I think there's like 33 in over 3,000 years. What is a dynasty? Well, a dynasty is like a set of kings. So if, for instance, if you guys know anything about the Plantagenet dynasty, have you guys ever read or studied English history, England, the kings of England, the Plantagenets? They're like a big long group. So basically a bunch of kings in one area, one time frame is considered a dynasty, usually by family origin. So there were over 30 of those. The Egyptian Empire lasted from about 3100 BC to about 1100. Now, the empire, that is. Now remember, after 1100, people started conquering them. Before that, for 2,000 years, no one ever conquered them. But after that, they were going to be conquered over and over and over. That's where they become instigators. Because one of the things we're going to find out is they sided with Babylon, then Babylon conquered them. They sided with Assyria. Assyria then conquered them. The Romans conquered them. The Greeks conquered them. Alexander the Great conquered them. A lot of people did after that. But the greatest time was Thutmose III around 1425. This is about the time where the Exodus happened. Okay? Where the Exodus happened. Now, let me just mention a few things about the Exodus. I was doing some study, and right now, there is truly no real archaeological evidence that the Exodus, I mean, they don't have any writings and everything, and we can understand they were wandering around the desert for 40 years. But what's interesting, and this is what historians say, it's like, it's not that they don't find anything, it's we just haven't found it yet, because where they were at was the middle of nowhere. Because they were basically wandering around in the desert of Sin, for 40 years. And how could you, what kind of writings are you going to do? Moses did some. You couldn't really do much writings. Now, although they have found coralized Egyptian, what are those guys called with the writing? The chariots. They found the coralized chariots in the Red Sea. They have found that. So even though a lot of people say, well, the Exodus didn't happen, it did happen. But the problem is there wasn't a lot of writing, because how could they? What can they do? They're walking around in the desert. You're like putting a tent up every few days. Hey, God's moving. Let's move. Get the tent going. Put the tent back down. Oh, there goes God again. Let's go move. That's what they did. So they also had a huge influence in the Canaanites, ties to Philistines. They had a huge tie to the Philistines. It's one of the reasons why Jerusalem and Judah did not like the Philistines very much, because they had ties to Egypt, and Egypt was kind of like the controlling factor in a lot of things in the Philistines. The Hyksos and Joseph. Now this is interesting. The Hyksos, these are people that came down to Egypt and ruled Egypt for about 100 years or so. Okay? Now, it's anywhere between about 1900 and 1500. They don't know exactly when it was. But interesting thing. Now, they were of Canaanite origin, meaning they came from north. Sounds like Joseph to me. Historians, it's as early as 1800, as late as 1500. Sounds like Joseph to me. It's about the right time. Could it be Joseph's sons? Now, interesting. Look at the picture here. Picture of foreign visitors wearing colorful robes. Who wore a colorful robe? Joseph. Okay? So, remember, Joseph was lost to Jacob. So Jacob thought Joseph was dead. He probably made more colorful robes for his family. And so when they came down, they actually ended up ruling Egypt. And they didn't rule all of it, just part of Egypt for a little while. So they're guaranteed this is something it's all from northern Canaan, which is where Abraham and those guys all came from. They were in colorful robes like they had. Very interesting information. So, is there any questions about Egypt? All right. Ethiopia, this is interesting. Ethiopia. Now, the Ethiopians believe they are Jews. Okay? So this is because of the Queen of Sheba. We see her in the Bible coming to see Solomon. We find her in both Kings and Chronicles. Most of the Ethiopians believe that what they call this, what the historians actually believe is that this is from Saba, which is now Yemen. So she's the Queen of Sheba or Saba, which is actually Yemen. That's where historians believe she's really from. But we see Queen of Sheba referenced in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. So most historians believe that she actually came from Arabia, now there's Saudi Arabia, but look at where it is compared to Ethiopia. Look at Yemen. It's like right across the way from Ethiopia, so it's very, very close. So most historians believe that's where they come from. Now Ethiopians truly believe that they're come from that area. There is a tradition in Ethiopia that Solomon bore a child with the Queen of Sheba. It's a tradition. She returned to Ethiopia and with Solomon's child linked the Ethiopians to the Jews. So the Ethiopians believe, and I'm not here to tell them that they're completely wrong, but that's what they believe, that she had a child from him. But historians truly just don't believe it. They said, there's no true linkage, there's no DNA linkage, there's nothing really to link them. But many Ethiopians say, well, we're Jews. So take that for what it's worth. All right, Phil, this is for you. I created this for Phil. And because Phil asked me, last time I taught this class, that can you give me a timeline? And I literally created this for Phil because I wanted to say, no problem, Phil, here you go. Here's your timeline, dude. All right, so here's kind of a timeline of the Bible. All right, Abraham left the land of Ur around 2100 BC. We'll talk about Ur in a little bit. The Egyptian captivity started in around 1984, the time that Van Halen released their popular album. Oh, wait a minute, that wasn't right. That's not right. All right. The Exodus in 1454, around that time, that's when it happened. Solomon died around 931. And let me tell you guys, if you want to know some dates, I'm not going to expect you to know all these dates, but if you want to know a few dates in the Bible, these are good dates to know because it helps you know where everything is in history. So these are some really good dates. Solomon died in 931. The kingdom split after that. We'll go into that in a few weeks. Assyrian captivity happened it was around 722. Around 712, but it was 722. The rise of Babylon came from about 604 to 586. The temple was destroyed in 586. The Jews returned to Babylon in 538 under Cyrus. The second temple completed in 516. Malachi in the end of the Old Testament around 450. And the Maccabean revolt in 167. We will go into all of those guys. We're going to talk about most of those guys today. Now, we will not talk about the Maccabean revolt, and we're not going to talk about Greeks or Romans, but we'll go into most everybody else. The Fertile Crescent. So now we're moving past Egypt and we're going to what we call Mesopotamia. Now again, look at that nice little line up there where there's nothing down below. Not a lot of people went into the Syrian desert to the where we now have Saudi Arabian desert. It's not much down there. But the Fertile Crescent is basically an area that's kind of green. Now, green is a relative term in the desert. There's just some places are a little better than others, but they're not. Not like we're not talking green like Pennsylvania green, okay, or green like Ohio green or whatever. This is not like that. These guys pretty much had the ability to grow crops in the middle of the desert. So that's kind of the Fertile Crescent. The land of Sumer. Now this is the time frame in which we find Abraham. And so that's where I'm going to start with Abraham. Sumer was basically right in this area down here by the Persian Gulf. If you look up here, the Persian Gulf is way down there. But so we're going to be see where it says Sumer, down there. That's where we're at right now. Okay, a lot of people in the area, and there are two major rivers here. There are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Okay, Tigris and Euphrates rivers. A lot of people live down here. This is where Babylon's going to be, is down this area. This was really, really well populated at its time. Now, Mesopotamia, you've probably heard that name, Mesopotamia. It's actually of Greek origin. Does anybody know why we say a lot of things? And I'll tell you the truth, a lot of the words in our Old Testament come from the Greek. Anybody know why? Yes, Amy, I know she does. The common language, who brought that language here? Alexander the Great. Yes, Alexander the Great. It was the common language of Alexander the Great. But wait a minute. This is the Old Testament, and Alexander the Great didn't come around till 324. It's because when they had the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. Remember the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Greek Old Testament, and everything was translated from that. So most of the way we actually spell things, even in the Bible today, is from that. It's not from the original Hebrew, it's from the Septuagint. And we're almost done with this. Come more. So basically, Mesopotamia is around 600 miles long. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates River, and it receives very little rain, but the rivers give it the ability to have fertility. The Sumerians were the people. Now, these are not the Sumerians. Don't confuse them with the Sumerians. Sumerians we'll talk about are the guys above Judah that they don't like each other. We'll get to those guys later. The Sumerians were the ancient city of Sumer, which was the first populated place. And the reason why I'm setting this up is because of Ur. You give me a couple more minutes. Land of Ur. Ur was where, who was from? Who was from Ur? Abraham. Abraham was from Ur. Yes, so Ur was the Paris of the Mesopotamia. No, seriously, they were there's like London. We're talking, it's New York. I mean, we're talking the place to go. If you wanted to be anywhere in 2000 BC, you wanted to say, yes, I'm from, hey guys, where are you from? You're from where? I'm from Ur. I mean, come on, imagine that. I'm from Ur. But, they're like, ooh, Ur, wow. But the thing is that was the place to be. So the question is, why the heck would Abraham want to leave such an awesome city? Well, sadly, one of the reasons why God does everything for a reason, Ur was destroyed about 100 years within 100 years after Abraham left, literally flattened. It lasted for a couple thousand years, and it was flattened about 100 years later. That would be one reason. But the other reason is because God told him to. Home of Abraham. Abraham left around 2150 BC. And about 50 years later, the Elamites destroyed the city. Ooh, well, God got them out in time. But it's important, why would someone living in such a great city want to move and leave? Why do you think that when God talks about Abraham, he talks about him and says, he had faith? Why would you leave? Now, remember what the desert looked like when I showed you those pictures, the western desert? That's where he went to. It was ugly. It was yucky. But he went there. Why? Because God told him to. That's what he's talking about. God said, all right, head north, go to Egypt. And you're like, wait a minute, I like this place. This is a great place. I love the place. It's going great. You want me to go up to this desert where it's ugly and nasty and I got to take all my family and everything else? Yes, I do. Oh, okay. So Abraham did it. So the thing is, he left a wonderful place because God told him to. One more slide. Abraham's journey comes from Genesis 12. Romans chapter 4 talks about his faith, and Hebrews 11, 8 through 11 talks about his faith. So not only that, but God also told him to sacrifice the one thing that he had when he was 90 years old. Think about if you're barren and God gives you a child at 90 years old, you think you want to kill that child? You don't. You're 90 years old. There's no way. God's promised you a son. He gave it to him. And now he's like, go ahead and kill him. That's faith. And that's it for today, guys. We will go through the rest next week. One more week of this. And after that, we're going to do the law. Now, let me just give you guys one little bit of advice. If you want to prepare to go to reading the law in 2 weeks, please read the book of Romans and the book of Hebrews. That will help you to go through the law. All right? So other than that, thanks, guys. Have a great day. Enjoy yourselves. Uh-huh.